In the winter of 1859, on a bare ridge in the eastern Sierra Nevada, a prospector named William Bodey was hauling supplies back toward a mining camp that did not yet have a name. He had found gold in that ground a few months earlier, and he had gone down to the valley for provisions to see the winter through. A storm caught him in the open. The snow came sideways across ground that offers nothing to hide behind, and William Bodey froze to death within a few miles of the claim that would make other men rich. The place that grew where he died would carry a misspelled version of his name. Within about 20 years, it would hold close to 10,000 people. Within about 50, it would hold almost none. Today, you can still walk the street of that town. The wind almost never stops, and it moves through the empty buildings with a sound that people who work there stop hearing after a while. Inside the houses, the tables are still set. There are dishes in the cupboards and curtains going to threads in the windows. It looks less like a ruin than like a town whose people stepped out for the afternoon and simply never came back. This is the story of Bodey, California. It is a story people usually get wrong at the end. They will tell you a great fire destroyed it, or that the place was cursed, or that it just faded into legend. What actually killed Bodey was simpler and colder than any of that. It was a town built on a single body of gold-bearing rock. It existed for one reason, and when that reason ran out, everything else was only a matter of time. To understand how a city rose on that windswept ridge, you have to understand what gold did to people in that era. Gold had been found across the Mono Lake country as early as the 1850s, in the wake of the Great California Rush. Most of the early finds were modest. Bodey's own strike, in the summer of 1859, was promising but not immediately spectacular. For its first 15 years, the camp that took his name was a miner place, a scatter of miners working surface deposits, never more than a few dozen to a few hundred people, always on the edge of being abandoned for the next rumor over the next ridge. Many camps like it were born and died in a single season. Bodey nearly did the same. What changed everything was an accident underground. In 1875, a mine cave-in exposed a vein of ore far richer than anything the surface diggings had suggested. Rock that had looked ordinary turned out to be threaded with gold. Word of that kind of discovery moved faster than almost anything else in the 19th century. In 1877, a mining outfit called the Standard Company bought into the district and began pulling out ore in quantities that turned a dying camp into a destination. The Standard Mine and the Bodey Mine beside it became the engine. Money followed the ore, men followed the money, and a town assembled itself on the ridge almost overnight. Here is what that looked like at its height, around 1880. Bodey's main street ran for more than a mile. The town held somewhere close to 10,000 people, which made it, for a brief window, one of the larger settlements in California outside the coast. There were around 22 operating mines feeding a row of stamp mills that crushed the ore day and night, so that the ground itself seemed to hum. Stand anywhere on that street and you could feel it through the soles of your boots. There were 2 churches and at least 2 newspapers, and a telegraph line that connected this remote ridge to the rest of the country. There was a post office, a school, breweries, general stores stacked with goods hauled in by wagon, boarding houses, a jail, a firehouse, and, by most accounts, several dozen saloons. There was even a small Chinatown and a red light district, and the ordinary machinery of a real city, all of it improvised at high altitude in a place with almost no water and almost no trees. It is worth understanding plainly how the wealth was actually pulled from the ground, because the method is part of why the town lived and died so fast. Quick note before we carry on. I put together a field guide to 24 of these places, where they are, what happened to them, and whether you can still get in. Coordinates for every site and an honest note on the ones that are already gone. Scan the QR code on the right or the links in the description if you want it. Now back to it. The dominant power in Bodey was the Standard Consolidated Mining Company, which controlled the richest ground and, in the good years, paid out substantial dividends to shareholders far from the mountain. The ore went from the tunnels to the stamp mills, where iron stamps pounded it to sand around the clock, and the crushed rock was washed over copper plates coated in mercury that caught the gold. Over its life, by some estimates, Bodey yielded on the order of $34 million in gold and silver, an enormous sum for the time. But almost none of that stayed on the ridge. It went out as bullion and as dividends to owners and investors elsewhere, which is the quiet truth of most mining towns. The wealth passes through. The people are paid wages to move it along, and when it stops, they are left holding nothing but a cold address at altitude. Consider what it actually took to feed that mile of Main Street. Bodey had almost no timber of its own and almost no fuel, and the mines were hungry for both. They needed wood to shore up the tunnels and cordwood to fire the boilers that ran the stamp mills, and the mills ran day and night, crushing rock in a roar that residents said they stopped hearing only when it stopped. All of that wood had to come from somewhere else. So did the food, the whiskey, the window glass, the cast iron stoves, the newsprint, and the coal oil for the lamps. Everything that made Bodey a town rather than a hole in the ground was dragged up the mountain behind teams of horses and mules, over rough roads, in a climate that could kill an animal as easily as a man. A place like that runs on freight, and freight runs on money, and the money came out of one set of mines. And the winters are their own character in this story. Bodey sits on an exposed ridge above 8,000 feet with nothing to break the weather. Winter temperatures fall far below zero, and the wind, which almost never stops, drives the cold straight through walls and clothing. Snow could bury the town and cut the roads for days. People died of exposure, of pneumonia, of the ordinary violence of a place where medicine was scarce and warmth was expensive. Living in Bodey was a bargain a person made with a hard mountain, and the only thing on the other side of that bargain was gold. Nobody endured a Bodey winter for the view. They endured it because the ground was paying them to. The instant it stopped paying, the mountain simply became a mountain again, and there was no reason on earth to spend February there. The reputation Bodey earned in those years was as wild as its wealth. It became a byword for violence. Newspapers of the day printed a steady run of shootings, stabbings, and stage robberies, and the reputation stuck. There was a stock phrase in the region, the bad man from Bodey, used the way people now use shorthand for somewhere dangerous. There is an often repeated legend of a little girl whose family was moving to the town, who wrote in her diary, "Goodbye, God, I am going to Bodey." No one can prove any child ever wrote those words, and it hardly matters. The story survived because it told you everything the rest of the country believed about the place. Bodey had become famous, and part of what it was famous for was the sense that ordinary rules did not reach that far up the mountain. It is worth sitting for a moment with who those 10,000 people actually were, because the legend flattens them into gunfighters and gamblers. Most were nothing of the kind. They were miners who went down into the dark for wages, and the women who ran the boarding houses that fed them, and shopkeepers, teamsters, clerks, launderers, saloon keepers, a school teacher, a doctor or two, and the several hundred residents of the town's Chinatown who did much of the labor and trade that kept the place running, with their own laundries and herb shops and a Taoist temple in their quarter. The town had labor unions and benevolent societies, a school full of children and a children's brass band, volunteer fire companies with their hand-drawn engines, undertakers and lawyers, and all the ordinary institutions of a real American city. The violence was real enough, but the daily texture of the town was work, not gunplay. At its peak, Bodey was larger than most of the interior settlements of California and Nevada at the time, a full-blown industrial city set down in country that could not support a farm. And every part of it sat on the same narrow foundation. It was all balanced on the ore. The appetite kept growing. The demand for wood was so relentless that the mine owners built a railroad just to feed it. In 1881, at almost the exact moment the boom began to turn, the Bodey Railway and Lumber Company laid a narrow gauge line running roughly 32 miles south toward the forests near Mono Lake. Its purpose was not to carry passengers or gold. It was built to haul cordwood and timber up to the mines in the town, because the surrounding hills had already been stripped bare. Think about what that tells you. At the height of its wealth, Bodey had consumed the wood of an entire region and had to reach further and further out just to keep its boilers lit. The railroad was a symptom of appetite, and appetite on that scale is only sustainable as long as the thing paying for it holds out. Everything you have just seen, the 10,000 people, the stamp mills running day and night, the children's brass band, the Taoist temple, the railroad reaching 32 miles for firewood, all of it ran on that same narrow foundation. And then, almost as quickly as it had risen, Bodey began to fall. This is the part of the story almost everyone gets wrong, and it does not involve a fire. The turn came around 1881, and nothing dramatic marks it. There was no single disaster. There was no flood, no massacre, no sudden collapse. What happened was quieter and more final than any of those. The richest, most easily worked ore began to run out. This is the single fact the whole history turns on. Bodey was not a farming town that could shift crops, or a river port that could carry new trade, or a rail hub that would matter as long as the rails ran. Bodey was a mining town in the most literal sense. Its entire economy was the gold in a specific body of rock beneath a specific set of hills. As long as the Standard and the Bodey mines could pull payable ore out of the ground, the town thrived, because the companies paid wages and dividends, and the wages and dividends paid for everything else. The saloons and the stores and the school teacher's salary and the freight wagons. The moment the payable ore started to thin, that entire structure lost its foundation. The mines did not close in a day. They kept working the lower grade rock for years. But the trend only ran one direction. Every year there was a little less worth digging, and every year a few more people packed up and left for the next strike, because that was the logic of their whole lives. Miners followed ore. When the ore faded here, the ore was brighter somewhere else. Watch what that does to a town. The single men left first because they had the least holding them, and they were the majority. Then the businesses that served the single men began to close because their customers were gone. Then the families who had stayed for those businesses found there was no longer a school worth keeping open, or a doctor within reach, or a store that stocked what they needed, and so they left too. Each departure made the next one more likely. A town is a web of people who need each other, and once you begin pulling threads out of the middle of that web, the whole thing sags toward the center and then falls in. By the early 1890s, the population that had been near 10,000 had fallen into the hundreds. The city was already, in every way that counted, gone. And this was 40 years before the fire that supposedly destroyed it. The fire everyone remembers, the one of 1932, was not even the first to gut the town. In 1892, when Bodey was already well into its decline, a fire tore through the business district and destroyed a large part of it, and the shrunken town rebuilt only a fraction of what was lost. That earlier fire is a marker of how far Bodey had already fallen, because a thriving city rebuilds after a fire and a dying one does not. So by the time the second, larger fire came in 1932, reportedly set by a small boy with matches, it was burning a town that had already burned once and only partly recovered, a town whose population had drained away decades before. The two fires together are less the cause of Bodey's death than its punctuation. Two hard stops in a long sentence that had really ended when the ore gave out. Bodey held on, in a diminished way, for decades. A few hundred stubborn residents stayed. People kept living in Bodey the way people keep living in any place that is slowly emptying, out of habit and attachment, and the simple fact that leaving costs money and effort. The decline was not a straight line. As the rich ore thinned, the companies consolidated, and new owners kept looking for ways to wring value out of rock the first generation had thrown away. Around the turn of the century, new chemical methods, cyanide processing chief among them, made it possible to recover gold from the old tailings, the mountains of crushed waste the early mills had left behind. For a while that gave the town a faint second wind, but none of it changed the underlying arithmetic. Reprocessing old waste is not the same as a new bonanza. It is scraping the bottom of a barrel that will not refill. Each revival was smaller than the last, and each one ended, and the long line of the graph kept sloping down toward zero. For a while it looked as though Bodey would simply disappear, the way almost every mining camp of its era disappeared, scavenged for lumber and hardware, and then erased by weather until nothing was left but foundations and the shape of streets in the sagebrush. Thousands of western boomtowns went exactly that way. What saved Bodey was not luck, and not a curse. It was a decision. And it comes down largely to one family and the people they hired. A businessman named James Stuart Kane had come to Bodey in its boom years and, over time, become the principal property owner in the dying town, holding much of what was left as the population fled. Rather than let the empty buildings be stripped to nothing, the Kane family paid caretakers to live in Bodey through the long, lonely decades, watching over the abandoned houses and their contents, chasing off scavengers, guarding against fire. For years, a mostly empty town at the end of a hard road had a human being whose whole job was to keep it from disappearing. It is one of the stranger vigils in American history. Without that decision to guard rather than sell off what remained, there would be almost nothing left to see. In 1961, the site was recognized as a National Historic Landmark, and in 1962, the Kane family's holdings passed to the state of California, which made it a state historic park. And the state made an unusual choice about how to preserve it. They chose not to restore it. The principle they adopted is called arrested decay, and it is the reason Bodey feels the way it feels. Restoration would have meant repainting the buildings, fixing the roofs, making the town look as it did in its prime. Arrested decay means the opposite. It means you stop the damage from getting worse, but you do not undo the damage that time has already done. You keep the roof from collapsing, but you do not repaint the faded sign. You stabilize the leaning wall, but you leave it leaning. The result is a town frozen not at its peak, but in the middle of its long dying. The goods are still on the store shelves because someone chose to leave them there. The tables are still set. Bodey is maintained by the state and by the Bodey Foundation that works alongside it in a permanent state of almost. There is a legend the rangers there have never worked very hard to correct. It is called the Curse of Bodey. The story goes that anyone who takes something from the town, a nail, a bottle, a piece of wood, a rock, will be followed by bad luck until they send it back. The park is said to keep letters from people mailing back the things they took, along with apologies and accounts of the misfortune that supposedly followed them home. Almost certainly there is no curse. What there is a small and elegant piece of folklore that does a real job, which is to keep people from carrying off a town one souvenir at a time. A place preserved in arrested decay is fragile in a specific way. It survives only as long as everything stays where it is. The curse is a story that protects the objects, and the objects are the whole point. To reach Bodey today, you drive a long way off the highway, the last stretch of it unpaved, climbing into a landscape that makes it instantly obvious why nobody would live here without a reason. There are no services in the town, no restaurant, no hotel, only the buildings and the wind, and a small museum set up in one of the surviving structures. You walk the dirt streets among houses you can peer into but not enter, and inside, you see the arrested decay up close. A bed frame, a cook stove, patterned wallpaper hanging in strips, bottles on a shelf, a schoolroom with its desks still in rows and lessons still faintly on the board. It is quiet in a way that is hard to describe to someone who has not stood there, a quiet made louder by the constant wind. Rangers ask you to take nothing, and they will tell you with a straight face about the curse. And when you leave, driving back down out of the mountains, you carry the specific discomfort of having stood inside the honest ending of a place that once believed, as every boomtown believes, that the good years would simply go on. Because in the end, the objects are what Bodey has to say. Every abandoned place carries a lesson, and Bodey's is not about ghosts, and it is not about the fire. It is about what happens to a place that is built on a single reason to exist. Bodey was, for a moment, extraordinary. It pulled 10,000 people to the least hospitable ground imaginable and gave them newspapers and telegraph lines and churches and a mile of Main Street, all on the strength of the gold in one set of hills. And the very thing that made it possible was the thing that doomed it. Because a town that exists for one reason is only ever as permanent as that reason. The gold was always going to run out. It is the nature of gold. And when it did, nothing about the churches or the newspapers or the 10,000 people could argue the town into surviving, because none of those things were why anyone had come. That pattern did not end with the gold rush. Across the country, there are towns built on a single mine, a single mill, a single factory, a single employer whose payroll is the only thing holding the streets together. They look permanent, while the one thing is running. They have schools and downtowns and families who cannot imagine leaving. And then the one thing closes, and within a generation the same slow unwinding begins. The single people first, then the businesses, then the families, then the empty houses with the curtains still in the windows. Bodey is not a curiosity from a vanished age. It is the clearest, best preserved example of a story that is still happening, in slower motion, in places that do not yet know they are Bodey. So when you stand on that ridge now, with the wind pushing at your back and the mountains going on empty in every direction, and you look through a wavy pane of glass at a table someone set for a meal that was never eaten, you are not looking at a tragedy or a haunting. You are looking at the honest arithmetic of a place that had one reason to exist. The people who set that table were not driven out. They were not cursed. They simply followed the same logic that had brought them. And when the gold that called them there fell silent, they answered the only way that made sense. They left the dishes where they were, and they walked down the mountain, and the wind took the town. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to hit the subscribe button in the middle to watch more forgotten places and abandoned history from across America. Then click the video on the left to watch similar stories like this. Or if you really want to get stuck in, click the playlist on the right. New videos every week. I'll see you in the next one.